Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 1, New France and British North America, 1713 to 1800. This is Lesson Number 9. How did the 7 Years' War impact the French? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Imagine that Canada is taken over by another country. How would you feel? Well, you put the video on pause so that you can consider this question, write down your response, and then we'll talk about it at the start of tomorrow's class. All right, and now that you've written down your response to this question, let's proceed. The 7 Years' War still stirs strong emotions in Quebec, even though the war took place over 250 years ago. In fact, many French Quebecers refer to the 7 Years' War as the War of Conquest. That is because, in Quebec, many French-speaking citizens see the war as a hostile takeover of the Canadian by a foreign power, in this case, the British. And for those of you who have not had a chance to visit Quebec City, this is a very interesting image here. This cannonball is lodged in a tree that can be found at the corner of Rue Saint-Louis and Rue de Corps de Garde in Quebec City. The cannonball was fired in 1759 and remains an interesting tourist site, as well as a reminder to Quebecers of their ancestors' defeat at the hands of the British. In 1759, the French proposed certain conditions for their surrender in a document called the Articles of Capitulation. These conditions were designed to protect the future of everyone living in New France, the Canadiens, the Acadians who had moved to New France after the expulsion, and the First Nations. The question was, would the British consider the articles and agree to protect the rights of the French-speaking citizens? The British actually agreed to the terms outlined in the articles. The conditions concerned the treatment of French soldiers and settlers, property rights, and religion. British General James Murray was in charge of making sure that his soldiers obeyed these conditions as they rebuilt Quebec City. As you can see from this painting, there's a lot of work to be done in Quebec City following the 7 Years' War. For example, this church had to be completely restored. In the years following the war, the British had to decide how to rule a colony that was mostly French-speaking and Catholic. There were several options. The British could expel the French, in other words, make them leave and go someplace else. The British could allow the French to preserve their laws, language, and religion. The British could set up separate areas for the French to live in, where they could practice their own laws, religion, and speak French. The British could force the French to become British subjects and give up their language, laws, and religion. Or, finally, the British could allow both the British and the French cultures to coexist. With the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British started taking greater control over the French by making new laws for them to live by. The Catholic Church lost the power it had to govern the people as British laws started to replace French laws. French-speaking Catholics were not allowed to have a position within the government. If they wanted to be in the government, they had to convert to Protestantism. That's a different branch of Christianity. By bringing more British settlers into Quebec, the plan was to assimilate the French, in other words, make them fit into the British way of life. To keep even tighter control, the British wanted the French to swear an oath of allegiance to the King of England, meaning that the French would have to promise to be good and loyal British citizens. By 1770, the Canadiens knew that their religion, language, and way of life were under attack. Around this time, Marie was replaced by Sir Guy Carleton as the governor of Quebec. Carleton showed greater compassion for the French for different reasons. First, the British settlers living in the British colonies south of Quebec were unhappy with British rule. They were beginning to make threats to separate the colonies from Britain. Carleton also realized that there were still more French-speaking people in Quebec than there were English speakers. If the Canadiens were to become angry with the British government, they might try to join with the colonists to the south and fight against the British. And just as a heads up for a future lesson, this is one of several famous paintings from the time period showing British colonists living in the South, or the 13 colonies. And take a look at the flag in the background. I think this flag gives you a pretty big hint as to what happened with these unhappy settlers and what actions they decided to take. In order to keep the Canadiens happy, Carleton appointed some Canadiens to government positions, and he supported the Catholic Church. He also believed that some French laws should be restored in Quebec. In 1770, Carleton traveled to London to convince the British government to change the laws to restore harmony in Quebec. And for his efforts to support the French culture in Quebec, a university was named in honor of Sir Guy Carleton. The university was founded in 1942 and is located in present-day Ottawa. Carleton's efforts paid off. The British government passed the Quebec Act 1774, which restored a number of French rights. These rights included freedom of religion, the right for Catholics to hold government positions, restoration of French civil or property law, restoration of the seigneurial system, and expansion of French territory. The First Nations were not happy with the expansion of French territory because it meant that French settlers were now allowed to move into lands which had been reserved for the First Nations. Many Canadiens were displeased that the government would be made up of appointed or chosen rather than elected officials. However, the Quebec Act was successful in keeping the peace and allowed for the continued growth of a French society within a British colony. So it's interesting to take a look at change in the map of North America between 1763 and 1774. When the British first passed Royal Proclamation, New France, or Quebec, was massively shrunk, with a lot of territory being given to the native peoples. But then only 11 years later, with the passage of the Quebec Act, you can see Quebec is much larger, and unfortunately, a lot of that Indian territory, as it was called, in other words, First Nations land, was actually given to Quebec. And we'll be talking more about this, as well as how people in the 13 colonies felt about these changes in a future lesson. But for now, let's finish today's lesson by discussing the following. Number one, do you think the British considered that the French culture would continue to exist in North America 250 years into the future? And number two, what artifacts, what historical things do you think are important for helping us understand what life was like when the British took over Quebec? What you're going to do is put the video on pause so that you can consider both of these questions, write down your responses, and we'll talk about these in tomorrow's class. If you don't feel ready to answer these two questions, it means you need to go back, watch the video at least a couple more times, and then when you're confident, put the video on pause. And I look forward to hearing everybody's responses to these questions, as well as our starting question from the beginning of this video. But until then, this concludes today's video.